2021, Biden faces challenges from surge of migrants at the border. So the question is, what's different? What's happened? And really, the main answer or the main conclusion that I could come to is that a lot of time has gone by, but we're still dealing with the same issue. So I think really part of the challenge in this is that we've really failed to develop some long-term solutions. We're still dealing with a reactionary mode to a problem that's been going on for hundreds of years in different contexts all over the globe. And the question is, what do we need to do to really solve it? And of course, I don't have all the answers, but I can talk about what we've done, what we've been doing over the 100 years that we've been in existence, and how that might help us focus in on and at least tackle some of the issues. So for me, the crisis really is more a political issue. And the political issue is about winning is staying for some people, and going is losing. And for other people, it's the exact opposite. And people have really focused this humanitarian crisis on immigration in particular. And for us, yes, there are immigration issues that need to be solved and have needed to be solved for many years. And there are problems all around the world regarding immigration and immigration law. We agree that that is a problem and that it needs to be addressed. And there are a lot of people trying really hard to address it, although we have really stubborn politicians who will not work together. So that's another part of the problem. But for us, it's about coming up with solutions in the best interest of the child. This problem has to be reframed from the perspective of the child. And sometimes you can find something that's best. Sometimes it's choosing between the better of the least good options. And sometimes it's making the best of a situation that is not really ideal at all, but there's nothing you can do about it legally. So we have to find ways to really focus on how to do what's best for a child, given the myriad of circumstances that are not always going to be ideal. We all acknowledge that there isn't a perfect one-size-fits-all solution. So I just want to give a nod to this because it's an important part of the problem, but it's not the piece that I'm going to talk about today. But reception and placement obviously is the thing that everyone is focusing on now because it's the emergency. It is the thing that is happening. There are a lot of people coming. We have failed in the US to create a better system of receiving people, in caring for people, and making sure that we're providing best possible care, despite the fact that we have a lot of guidelines and best practices. And I'm just going to leave you with a few that we all know. The UN guidelines on alternative care give us lots of clues about good care situations. ISS developed a Children on the Move manual. The first 4 steps of the manual deal with reception and placement. ISS submitted last May a submission to the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and talked about immigration detention and children seeking adequate reception and care from 5 different country perspectives. And recently, UNICEF just released their Building Bridges for Every Child Reception and Care Services to Support Unaccompanied Children in the United States. So the point of this is, in response to this crisis at our border, we have lots of good guidelines from a lot of different perspectives, from the US perspective and from global perspectives. And there are many people working on this issue to try to solve how are we going to process, receive, care for, and provide temporary care until solutions are reached. And all I can say is for all those working on that issue, carry on, but ISS is going to focus on durable solutions. That's where we really put our energy. So without further ado, I want to focus on that. So what are durable solutions or sustainable solutions? What can we do? So number one, as soon as possible after a child arrives and at our border or anywhere, and I sort of ripped this from John F. Kennedy, ask not only whether a child family should seek to pursue immigration relief, but what is in the best interest of the child. And ISS has been advocating for this in all kinds of conventions and law since the 1950s. I know we have an immigration situation that we have to uphold, but we also need to really focus on what's in the best interest of the child. The entire dynamic of the conversation changes when we start asking those questions right off the bat. So while we need lawyers to assess and work with families if they choose to pursue legal remedies, we also need to be realistic about it. Are the families who are getting legal representation, are they likely and realistically going to have an immigration claim? Is every family member going to have a claim? Or what if only one family member has a claim? What do we do? And we are not in the business of splitting up families. So the question is, what do we do? What's in the best interest of the child? So the solution is not only a legal one. And while we have really heavily invested in a legally focused solution, ISS argues that case management is a critical piece to this from the beginning, that a case manager could really be instrumental in not only helping pursue the legal channels, but also identifying all the different pieces of the puzzle. Social work is oriented toward the person and looking at the holistic situation and the needs of the individual and the family. So just to give an example from our own child welfare system, in child dependency cases, children have a lawyer, but there's also a social worker. And to be fair, social workers and lawyers do not always advocate for the same perspective. A lawyer is going to be advocating for what's in the best interest, which or what the child's wishes are, which may or may not be in the best interest, whereas the social worker is advocating for what's in the best interest, and those things have to be reconciled. So again, if we really want to put our best practices forward in this issue, we need to have a case management approach along with a legal approach to the problem. Okay, so I'm just going to click this over. Sorry, I'm losing my place in my thing. So a word about case management, what it is, what it isn't. I think one of the biggest challenges of being an international social work agency that primarily provides cross-border case management is that most general people don't understand what case management and even social work for that matter is. So it's not a new role, it's been used for decades. Case management has been an integral part in receiving new arrivals from all over the world. In the US, when large groups of immigrants came, there were resettlement organizations that did primarily case management. It's a really cost-effective role where lawyers can earn anywhere from $80 to $800 an hour in the US. The average case manager will earn $25 to $50 an hour, including benefits. So it's a very practical thing to do. Case managers will ensure that the child gets an immigration lawyer, has an appropriate language access, and link them to whatever services are needed. A good case manager builds rapport, so a family or a child can begin to trust that person, and they'll also seek that person. The case manager will be sought out for advice. They're not only in the business of fixing everything, but they're actually a resource for the family. Good case managers advocate for the people they work with, and ultimately encourage them to do things for themselves. Way back in my earlier career, I worked in the refugee resettlement program in the US, and we had to constantly train our case managers not to do everything for the newly arriving refugees, but to teach them how to get transportation, how to get to appointments and so forth, because our case managers love to drive them around, and that wasn't really helping them learn how to get around themselves. Good case managers ask a lot of questions. They want to understand, not assess. They work with the child and the family to make their own plans based on their own wishes. So the assumption that any of us know what's best for a family is a false assumption, and case management really helps families to articulate what they need. The second piece of this is contingency planning. In the US, in our child welfare system, we do what's called concurrent planning. So the goal obviously is family reunification whenever it's safe and practical to do. There are certain circumstances where we have to, at the same time as plan for reunification, plan for alternatives. If the family cannot receive the child for some reason, what about other family members can? Where do they live? Are they a potential resource? Using adoption as a last potential or the last stop on the continuum of options for children. And I think in this context of children at our border, we need to do the same thing. We don't only need to pursue an immigration route or remain in the US route. We need to be concurrently planning, what if those things don't work? What are the opportunities for that family to go back? Where would they go back to if not their immediate, the community that they left? Is there somewhere else they could live, or family members in other parts of their country? So exploring those options at the same time as pursuing legal remedies are definitely ways to keep all options open for families so that there aren't any sudden movement. In terms of the next step, case management is a really critical part for return and reintegration. And sorry, I just lost my place again. So in return and reintegration, just before the last administration, or just after the last administration took office, not the current one, the one before, ICE piloted a family case management program, which included federally funded return and reintegration. So a planning component to help families learn about what options would be available should they not be able to get relief, or should they choose to go home proactively. So it wasn't meant to be a way to funnel families out of the US. It was meant to be an option for concurrent planning, if you will. Unfortunately, this program was pretty much killed in the first couple months of the the last administration. So it has never been executed. But I just want to talk about what was involved in that and then what we've done since. So in the case management program as it was proposed, and as we were just about to sign to get it going before someone got wind of it and said, oh, this is going to actually help people, let's get rid of it. So the person who was working with the family, and often that would be in the family case management model, it was a case manager. But in the current situation, it could be a lawyer, somebody in shelter staff, or some other community member that has a relationship with the family, would refer the family to ISS. And we have a team of case managers who would provide how the program works and give them, just the general overview. And then if the family or the child or the responsible adult would like to move forward, what we do is refer the case to our partners on the ground, who are trained social workers licensed in their countries, who also are expert in case management. And their job was to, as soon as the referral, and this is all pre-departure, so we're calling this pre-departure planning, before they were leaving or even deciding whether they were going to leave, our case managers would go and visit the family or the place where the family was going to be returning. In most cases, these were separated children, so they were going to visit the family members currently in country and see what resources were available both in the home and in the community. And the important piece of this is when ISS does assessments to evaluate or to understand a home situation, we don't only look at the home. We actually do what we call a community resource assessment, which understands all the strengths and weaknesses of that particular community where the child is going to be returning to. Because what we found in child welfare, particularly working with judges and some social workers, is that a lot of people make a lot of assumptions and have a lot of bias about the situation in home countries based on what they hear on the news, based on what they read, but not based on any real information or having ever traveled to any of these places. And every community is different. We can't assume that just because countries in Central America have the highest violence in the world, that every community is bad. I mean, there are children and families growing up there every day. So we have to look at each individual community and make assessments about that place, not generalize about the whole country. So anyway, once the information is gathered, a plan is made. If the family does choose to go back, then we arrange for the family and child to be met at the airport by a case manager. Their family members who live often in remote areas travel sometimes 6 to 8 hours to meet the child at the airport. And then the case manager begins the hard work of building the rapport with the family and brainstorming options, helping them deal with some of their fears and concerns. And then we'll begin to identify services or options. And really, I think the one thing that people forget about case management, and even in this part of the world, there are services available in some places. Not every community is completely bereft of any kind of help. The real issue, particularly for the families that we've been working with who are largely rural and indigenous, is that there are 1,000,001 barriers for them to access those services. Number one being just flat out discrimination. So the case manager is really plays a key role in helping people overcome barriers to getting services. And that's really important because I think there's this assumption that there are no services. And this is an assumption often in the US too, but when it really comes down to it, there are services, they're just hard to access. You need to know about them, you need to know how to access them, and sometimes you need someone to advocate for you to be able to access them. So that's a critical piece. So whether the family seeks voluntary return or inevitably they're deported, planning the return, creating those pathways to accessing services is really the only way they can return with dignity and be prepared to the family can be prepared to protect the best interests of their child. So it's the planning piece is really important. So when the federal program fell through, we were not done trying to pursue this. So we were able to, back in 2008, yet another crisis when families were deliberately separated, we were able to get pilot funding to really implement this return and reintegration program, which we've been doing for the last couple of years. And I think we've served over 50 families and 100 children in this program. So we have found that planning ahead makes a big difference. Families know what to expect, which alleviates a lot of the stress, what's going to happen when I get there. And they have someone they can talk to about how they can make things work. And the family works together with the case manager in advance and often right after arrival to plan what they need to do. And some of the things that these are some examples from some of the things that we've learned through this process. One of the key things is, with the best of planning, we need to make contingency plans. And COVID has certainly been a massive, shed a lot of light on the fact that you can't just have one plan, but you need to have a backup plan. And travel delays are a big thing. And it's a particularly a big barrier, even more so now than ever before, with so many flights that don't happen anymore because people aren't traveling. So having a plan, a lot of families have to travel a long distance to get to the airport. So if a flight is delayed, then they need to have a plan of what they're going to be doing while they're waiting. Even, planning for food and things, they don't usually, plan for those contingencies. So our case managers have to be aware of all the things that can go wrong and have a plan for those. As I mentioned, sometimes the issue is about gaining access. So we had one of our earlier cases where a child was really sick when they went back. This is pre-COVID, but needed medical care. And the doctor wouldn't see them because the child's clothes weren't clean. So the case manager had brought a clean set of clothes, was able to negotiate and get the child medical care right away. The discrimination that these families face every day is ongoing and real, and sometimes the reason that they've left. And then there's an added stigma on having left and now returning to their communities. So case managers have to work with the family to help them overcome some of those things. And they're not easy. Those are like long serving things. In terms of service planning, it's a joint process. We don't do assessments. We do strengths and resource-based information gathering. We've created a whole capacity to do this work remotely now, thanks to COVID. So even during the pandemic, we were continuing on working with our families. Often it was our caseworkers in country, calling them by cell phone, and if they had internet technology, they would Skype with them or however they could see them. And then we are in the process of, we're going to be unveiling our best practice guidance that we've developed with help through the NEKC fund on how to do remote assessments. And we've gathered the best practices from our international network. And so we've created a whole training on that. And I think that's something that's going to be useful and here to stay. It's not the only way to do an assessment, but at least it helps keep information flowing and communication happening when you can't physically get to somebody. So the other important lesson that we've learned in this is that it's not only about the child returning, but helping the entire family with their most pressing needs. So for example, if a child that was separated at the border was returning home, it wasn't getting that child only enrolled in school, but getting all the kids enrolled in school so that they could all be going to school at the same time. So we ended up, we say we served 50 kids, but we served hundreds more because we tried to work with the entire family. The other piece of this is we thought we knew what families needed pre-COVID, but then COVID happened and we realized that families needed sometimes just food. And so we had to be really flexible in how we responded to our families. And getting food to remote areas during COVID was really difficult. And our case managers played an integral role in actually making that happen, because these families were literally starving in the rural areas and they were able to get massive amounts of food. They got special permission to travel within their country. So the case managers become the missing link in the supply chain, particularly in a pandemic or a crisis. We experienced the same thing during the hurricanes in Honduras, and our case managers had to pivot their work to be able to respond to what the families needed there. The trust that was built between families and social workers enabled families to reach out when they needed things. And that was really important because it's a two-way street in working in this project. Discrimination and isolation. Many families are indigenous and they live in really hard to reach areas. There are quick turnaround times often when people leave. These are some of the challenges that we faced. And obviously there are limited resources for us too. This is not a federally funded initiative. This needs to be a federally funded, actually ultimately countries should be funding this on behalf of their own citizens. The US government does that on behalf of its citizens, but there need to be resources to help people return to their countries of origin with dignity and being able to protect the best interests of their children throughout the entire process. So now I'm going to move on to root causes. This is something that's also been in the news recently. No surprise, the headlines are pretty similar to as they were in 2014, except the amount of money that's being promised, or not promised, but projected is 4 times as much as it was in 2014. So the question is root causes. What can we do about those? What does the investment need to include in order to really make a difference in this? And ISS, it's really simple for us. While all the issues that are currently discussed in terms of civil society and getting rid of crime or dealing with crime and corruption and all the important things that need to be considered in all this, case management has to be included, and creating that social work network is just, it's never been invested in, even in their own countries, and it's something the US government should really support. As I mentioned earlier, case management is one of the most inexpensive investments any funder can make. Case managers don't make a lot of money and they do a lot of good. So the question is, how do we refocus this conversation on durable solutions? And how do we help people understand the value of case management and what it can do across borders, in country, both on our side of the border, on everyone else's countries of origin. So how do we make that part of the conversation and shift it away from staying and going and where do we house everybody? Because that has not yet, to this day, solved the problem. So anyway, our ask to you is help us advocate and help us change the conversation to one where we can really create some durable solutions. And link up with us on social media. I can certainly share all of our links so people can follow us, get our newsletter, and help us change the conversation to really focusing on the needs of family. And the second thing is, I think return and reintegration absolutely is an essential service in all this. Not because we want to make everyone go back, that is not at all the issue, but we need to give people a choice. Staying isn't going to be in the best interest of everybody. We've seen so much movement, global migration, particularly during the pandemic. We know people have to return and reintegrate all the time in many different scenarios. And it is something that can be done well. And by creating case management services and other things in country, we're building the capacity to really identify and address the root causes of migration in the first instance. So by building these structures to receive people, you're also building structures to support people so they don't feel like they have to leave in the first instance. So while we all know that prevention is the thing that we should be funding and focusing on, and instead we end up spending all of our funds on reaction and interventions, this is a great opportunity to really build a durable solution that hopefully will prevent these kind of influxes, because we'll be able to balance out and help people get back to their countries of origin if that's in their best interest. So I will leave it there and thank everyone so much for your attention. And I'm sure Elaine and I would be happy to answer or have a nice conversation about this.
Thank you, Julie, very much. And this is, so let me just take the discussion a little bit to be global and at the conceptual level. So what you are arguing is that in cases of migration and cross-border and migration back and forth, reunification and so forth, you're arguing the solution that we should be advocating for is case management, individual attention to situations of each child, and with support to the family accordingly. If now let's open up the floor to hear perceptions on that and experience. What worked, what doesn't in your experience? Questions and comments for Julie about the argument that case management is the approach we should take. Marie.
Yes, thank you so much. This was so clear and really very informative. Thank you. For me, there are several parts to what you just said. And where I believe we should begin is to, it's the hardest thing, to agree on what do we mean by the best interest of the child. For many people think it's right. I mean, it's obvious, maybe for ISS, but given Everett will recognize that we agonized over this particular issue at the Thai-Cambodian border many, many years ago, 1980. Its best interest of the child is not as clear as it seems, because it's actually based to a degree on ideologies, politics, philosophy of life. And to me, we are not, all the people acting at the border and the people I talk to are not necessarily in agreement. Mm-hmm. As you know, many people say, well, you know, America is a land of opportunity and etc. And yes, it's good if families stay together, but look, etc. And the child will be better off in America anyway. And I'm not just talking about America. This is a global issue. We've encountered it. I've encountered it in every emergency I worked in. So I think it would be really very, very important, and with government people, with all the actors there, that there should be, I don't know, a forum or different discussion. It would be fantastic if people could, okay, everybody won't agree, but at least we're working with the same goal, the same idea, the same agreement. Otherwise, it's going to be very confusing as it is now. So to me, that's really critical that we define this and we have a discussion. And then absolutely, case management, all the things you listed, and I think it's important that people know the range of services that are given, and without case management, it's just not only isn't going to work, but we're going to do a lot of damage. And in the country of origin, etc. I subscribe to everything you said. That's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie. Others?
Can I make a quick comment on the best interest? So just as it relates to our program, I think it's something we've seen on the ground a lot. And one of the pieces of the training that we do with our partners in country is this idea that many of these children who they'll be working with will return to their families without ever having gone through this, any kind of formal process around best interest determination, and in some cases, a fairly informal process. And so we understand that the reality, particularly in situations of emergency, is that there's not going to be that level of protection. And so the team there really has to work on kind of understanding a little bit of what was happening in the destination country, but it makes the role of the social work case manager in country that much more essential.
Thank you, Elaine. More comments, and then we'll come back. Yes, Cornelius. And we'll come back to you and Julie. Go ahead.
So thank you, Julia, and actually thank you, Elaine. Very interesting conversation. I was down in the border in, I think it's 2018, and had the privilege of traveling with at that time he was just dismissed, the head of Homeland Security that was dealing with this issue. Anyway, I went into some of the facilities, and you are one of the people who have stripped away the media hype and get at the heart of what we should get at. The child welfare, the child protection, and the work that needs to be done. And definitely, I do agree with you, it's about case management. The challenge is, do we have the numbers of caseworkers who are well trained and understand this? What I found down there was good-hearted, what are they called, border patrol staff, okay, trying to take care of children who had no clue what they were doing. And I keep repeating it over and over again. These people were not trained to be social workers.
No.
The establishment have provoked a situation where they have turned security people into trying to be social workers. So do we have the numbers? And just as you said, I can already see discussion going on about the infrastructure and not the human resources, like facilities in Guatemala. Okay, let's create a reception center. And nobody is talking about what you're talking about, the change the narrative. How many caseworkers do we need? What type of training should the caseworkers have, right? And for a long time, we in UNICEF have been advocating for a root-based child protection system. You know, it doesn't matter where the child is, but just like you're saying, all along the route, the social workers and the caseworkers should be working together. So the question is, would we have the numbers?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Cornelius. Fantastic. More comments, and then we'll come back to you, Julie and Elaine. More comments. Jim.
Question about, built on what you just said. What is your access stream to potential counselors? And is there any way that, and do you have volunteer corps? Have you ever experimented with working with volunteers? It just seems to me that the number of people that are concerned about this issue, and just thinking about the one on the US-Mexico border now, that would give you potential to access not only a lot of resources from throughout, let's say, this country, financial resources, but it would give you the potential to recruit a lot of people. Think Habitat for Humanity, and the way that they have, or think, you know, some of the other agencies that they're modeled off of. But what they have there is they have a community of people who really do want to help, and they have an extraordinary framework for how almost anybody can engage with them at some point and do some real good. So it's that organization of that effort that allows them to really utilize volunteers, and frankly, to really utilize a lot of small donations, because they can explain it, and the system, and having sort of been present at the very early part of Habitat and attending a number of those work plans and so forth, it's really quite a system. I just wonder if anything like that's ever been tried by your organization or in the world with other city plays.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. How do that, you know, ideas for solving this, what you call the shortage of case workers? Jean-Claude.
Yes, Looking at the lessons learned from the migration crisis in Europe, you know, in 2015, we have seen that many countries had a kind of repressive and institutional type response for the care and protection of migrant children. The countries who put into place case management and guardianship mechanisms were not relying on social workers. That's an answer to Cornelius. The best example in Europe is most probably Netherlands, you know, the Holland system. And all the guardians in Holland get trained by the government, but they are not paid, and they are volunteers, you know, as such. And it is the only country in Europe where the system remains sustainable and efficient during that massive influx of young people. Every other country relying on social workers, on judges, or whatever member of the administration, the whole system collapsed. That was the case in Italy, that was the case in Greece, and all the country along the route, you know. So I think when we think about case management and the guardianship mechanisms, we need now to think beyond social workers. And this is where we need to go back to the experience we have gained in Africa. You know, Cornelius knows I was working in DRC at the beginning of last year on post-Ebola, and where it has really, where we were capable of providing a decent response in child protection is where we have relied on the community members as such. Because if you rely solely on social workers, it cannot work. But you have to have a proper articulation in between the two mechanisms, you know, a kind of relay where community members can go back, you know, and in Netherlands and other countries where system is efficient, you have a reference center where guardians, you know, foster parents and others can go and look for support and advice whenever necessary, you know. So it's about thinking a different kind of system. Every time I see people advocating for an augmentation, an increase in the number of social workers, I know that the kind of proposal they make usually is not going to produce the expected result, because every time you will have a deficit in the number of social workers if you rely solely on these elements of the child protection system.
Fantastic, Jean-Claude, fantastic input. More comments, Mathilde.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Julie, for and for this wonderful presentation. A lot to think about. And yes, I hear you, and I hear you all about case management. And of course, we cannot emphasize more the need for good case management, case managers. And it's also a part of, you know, those children not being a number anymore. It's just they have an identity. They are different individuals, and so it's so easy to get caught in numbers. You know, each time we're talking about an emergency, it's this amount of children at this place of the border, but they're all individual, and only the case worker is going to know about them. But then there's also another part of the equation that you touched upon, Julie, and which is really close to my heart, which is the prevention. And it's, again, I mean, I've read, we've talked about that. Prevention, we always talk about prevention, because at the end of the day, that's what we should aim for, right? Because once they're here, once they have migrated already, the harm is done. And so, you know, even if we decide to, you know, return them in the best way, even if we decide for them to have the best case manager, they've already been in harm's way. So my question is also, how do we move back to systematically address, and this is to systematically address those underlying causes, root causes of the problem? And we know it's political, and we know, but at some point we'll have to do something about it. Otherwise, we keep on, having a better response. Yes, it's going to be better, but we're still going to be in the response mode. And so if we're going back again to the beginning of a child is a child and it shouldn't be hurt, that's the first best interest. It shouldn't be hurt at first. So it's always my thing on prevention. Thank you so much again.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mathilde. Another comment.
Nils here. Thanks again, Julie. A question. I visited in Homestead a base with 2,400 underage minors. Among other things, the rules didn't allow even for the volunteers to touch or even hug, and some of the young kids were crying and so on. And in one case, when a girl threw herself onto the arms of one of the volunteers, it was a large open space. They actually immediately brought in the security and they forced out the NGO from which this person was, and they were not allowed back. And so the question is of scale. How many have entered? We're talking thousands. And how can we design something that can work at scale and even during the time that they are waiting with more dignity? And how do you, all of you who are working in this area, how do you coordinate? How do you meet? Some of the many hundreds of questions that I have. Back to you.
Thank you, Niels. Yes. Shall we have one more question or so, and then we turn it back?
Martin.
Yes, Martin.
Yeah, I mean, really just to build a bit on those last comments and re-emphasize, I'm not an expert in this field at all, but having come across such an extraordinary variety of situations in which children are at risk during a migratory process, I think it's a bit overwhelming, and one wonders, is there any way in which organizations like yours and others can get together and begin to address all the hundreds of questions that Niels has and that I have about things like the role of traffickers. I mean, we have situations where children are being extracted from villages by persuasion for sort of commercial gain, and then sent on these extraordinarily perilous journeys. We have situations where on the French coast at Calais, you have children in, I mean, disastrously awful conditions, are being assisted by spontaneous groups of individuals, but where accredited organizations are not allowed or aren't able to function. And it just seems that the incredible complexity and range of dangers that children are confronted with, and the almost infinite variety of reasons why they're in these situations, it's one of those issues which governments are putting into the too difficult box and saying, well, we can't deal with that. We just let people sink or swim. I think it's a desperate situation.
Martin, thank you very much. I know we can go a long ways on this, but we'll, in the interest of time, Julie, what are your comments to these comments and questions?
Yeah, I have a lot of really good questions and probably not as many answers as you would like, but I think there's a common theme in all of the questions at some level, which is that all of these issues are almost too difficult, and yet they're absolutely essential they need to be addressed. So best interests, Marie, of course, it's a hugely debated,
Yeah.
I mean, we could debate it forever. And maybe it's the debate, the indecision or the we don't come up with an answer, and then people they think, well, if these guys can't come up with a definition in this situation, then we just, to heck with them, let's just worry about something else. So I think we have to keep that conversation alive and focus point and central. I think we have to agree that we're all going to have and this is a global conversation too, even in our network, from our context and our orientations and our background and expertise, we have different ways to interpret that, but we all still have to, in certain situations, come up with a range of answers and move forward. Otherwise we can't help people. So it's just about, keeping it moving and keeping it the focal point. It's an ideal, to really do something in the best interest. What is that? It's an ideal, but we have to do something practical in that situation. So if we could keep the conversation going around that and keep that in the forefront, that would be excellent. The social work capacity piece is a really interesting question. I do believe we could mobilize an army of social workers and case managers with the appropriate training to do this work. And it's essential that we be working toward building that capacity, not just in the US, but in these countries, sending countries. They are totally lacking social work support. The government provides very few social workers. We work with NGOs in large part. And there are a lot of people that are interested, they're social workers that don't have any work and no income. So if we could really boost that capacity, as well as consider a volunteer or a trained group of people to do specific kinds of case management in specific situations. I can say from experience, the US repatriation program is run through the Office of Human Service Emergency Preparedness at HHS. So they provide disaster case management in domestic situations. And the way they run it is they have contractors that train up case managers who can be deployed if there's a hurricane or some kind of other natural disaster. So there are models out there on how to train up and get a prepared workforce that can respond to particular things. But I don't think we should do that only. It needs to be done with building a long-term capacity of social work case management in every space that we need it, but partnering that potentially with a volunteer force. And I know that there's a huge conversation and a lot of research on the paraprofessional workforce and the professional workforce. I think we need both. There's a role for both to play. And if we ever want to scale, we need to create a lot of experts that can train other people to come in and do things in a particular situation. But we need the experts, so we got to keep building. Let's see, Matilda talked about the root causes issue is obviously near and dear. And I do believe that, and I agree with you, once they've left, the damage is done. But if we create the pathways back, the pathways in and of themselves will be part of helping to deal with the root causes. So one of the things that we've learned is, if you really want to understand what the root causes are, when you send people back and you understand what their situation is, there you have it. That was what made them leave in the first instance. So if we're addressing those things on the return, we can begin to address them to prevent other families from going. Again, the case management is only one piece of the puzzle, but it doesn't exist in the capacity that it nearly needs to. So if we address that piece of the puzzle, I think we would do a lot more than we've done with the last investment in root causes, where I couldn't find a single answer to what actually happened with that money and what have we to show for it now. So, and we haven't tried this, so I would say we should. And then lastly, I think, Martin, you raised too many questions for me that I can't answer, other than to say that we should rise to the challenge when things get too difficult, perceivably too difficult. That means that we need to be louder. Because I think people in the greatest of challenges do their best work. So if it was an easy problem to solve, clearly that's not as interesting as solving the complex one. So I think we need to come up with some immediate solutions, and then we have to have some zingers, if you will. But I don't think too difficult is ever a word that stopped a bunch of really concerned people in a global crisis at all. And in fact, it's just, to me, it's just, okay, challenge accepted, challenge on. We need to continue to find ways that solutions can trickle down into all the different complexities that are involved in the situation. So that's not a very satisfying answer to a lot of really difficult questions, but it's my best attempt, and maybe Lynn can augment.
Can I make just a couple of really brief things. I think to the issue of the case management numbers, I think one of the ways that we've talked about and we've been successful in kind of other areas of our work is to work in public-private partnerships, in particular with local NGOs who already have a really strong existing relationship with the child welfare system, whether it's DNAF or DIF or whoever in the country of origin. And so that's just an opportunity. I think it's already happening with UNICEF in Honduras. So I think there's opportunity to think about how that could even be brought in with other NGO partners. The issue I wanted to raise around the volunteers, I think is a really interesting one. When we get referrals for these kinds of cases, everybody's saying, and this kid needs mental health support. This kid needs mental health support. And we know that. And the notion of limited resources is certainly there. But I think one of the things what we think about with volunteers, particularly in kind of coming from the US, is that many of the families we've served in our programs have had no contact with outside organizations, even in their own country. They live so far even from the nearest city that there's so much work that happens at the case management level to really build trust in seeking services at a baseline. And so I think it's really important that the workers that we're bringing in and the ways that we do training are really as local as possible, because it's so important to have that cultural understanding, to speak the language, to have people who really have the that cultural understanding of what's going on. So I think there's definitely room for volunteers and paraprofessionals, but I think particularly in this work expanding and thinking about the families that we're serving on the ground, is there really has to be that attention to the child and the family specific history and their relationship to formal systems of care that either are new or are not very positive. That's the other piece of it. There's a lot of families who have had pretty negative experiences, as Julie alluded to, in their accessing services. And so I think it is really important that in the training and the building of these programs, there's an opportunity to, and as Mathilde brought up, thinking about these children not as numbers, not just like children needing services, but really connecting them at a child and family specific level.
Elaine, thank you very much for that comment. In the interest of time, we'll go our typical way of ending here is quick around the room. Final comments, very quick. I'd like to start with one comment myself, and that is from the work that we did on looking at the unaccompanied children's programs across the US and on the border. The feedback that I got from many workers is the fact that we're not approaching this strategically. The agencies are not coordinated in an effective way, and they're not approaching the problem in a strategic way. And so you end up with this feeling of this complexity of problems without strategic responses to them, sufficient ones. Obviously, the people are fantastic, dedicated professionals, and with every respect, but the approach to me makes me often think of, the UNICEF approach. And often we talk about, if you come to a country and you would say, you start with the big picture and say, how do we break this down into components? And I would just say, it's interesting to me that this problem seems to me, and on the basis of feedback from people, that we have not yet approached it with enough strategic, from a strategic enough perspective, meaning to find the practical ways to address it. And many of the things you've mentioned include that. Sorry, that's my quick response. Let's quickly go around the room in typical. Pilar, your last comment.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much, Julie, for this presentation. I like the idea of child center. I think that's key in all of this. I find it also very you said it's inexpensive. Yes, it's is probably labor intensive but not capital intensive. However, I think it's in terms of education and for the child, I think that is an aspect that I would like to see much more, how would I say, integrated into this.
Thank you very much, Pilar. Sadomini, last quick comment.
Thank you. Really hard to be quick because there's so much you brought up to talk about. On the case management, I mean, good case management, legal, mental health, it's complex, it's costly. I mean, good case management would be great. And it will be difficult, as you said. I think you recognize that. And I mean, if there's any time, a last point on asylum seeking and how do you deal with that? What is your position and perspective on that, which is a whole legal issue? But thank you so much. It was very, very interesting and great. Thank you.
Martin.
Just a last question, really. I mean, is this something that needs a global conversation? Yes. The child-centered approach to migration? And if so, who should convene it? UNICEF, maybe?
Right. Thank you. Excellent question.
Mm-hmm.
Jim, your final comment.
I thank you very much for this, but I really share Everett's view about strategy, because I'm very compelled by your story and what you're doing. I keep running into sort of roadblocks, and so I think if we could understand, its strategy needs to be more clear in order to be able to really, for me to think about who would be most interested in supporting this. That's just my take from the position I come from.
Okay, thank you very much. Marie?
Yes, absolutely strategy, but that really relates to the best interest of the child and the differing views on that. I didn't mean at all to stay with this. Obviously, case management and all the other services are needed. It doesn't mean we stop at that, but I'm afraid we begin with that. Doesn't have to be months of discussion, but yes, somebody should convene, although when some sort of dialogue with the key partners, but then I would say the government in this particular country, because from what I understand, they will ultimately make some rules. So I think we should engage government and others, could be UNICEF. And once we air the various ways we look at best protection of the child, then we can have a strategy and decide what to do. I think one of the confusion is, as you know, I'm not going to get into that, but there's so many differing ideas, and some will ship all the kids to American families and others will ship them all back, and then everything in between. So unless we have some kind of discussion about what we think is the best, first put the child in the center, indeed, and then what we believe is the best, because if every little agencies and volunteer believe something different, the confusion will continue, and it's really not very good. The second thing, just quickly, yes, numbers are enormous and overwhelming, but I think any of us who have worked in emergencies for years have encountered huge numbers. Not that we always had a wonderful response. I mean, it's never perfect, but it can be done with if we all work together. Again, strategy and synchronism. That's it.
Thank you, Marie. Peter, final comment? Peter? You've dropped, you froze and then dropped. Fred.
Yeah, great presentation. It's hard to be short, as everyone said, but thinking on the big picture level and leaving aside the politicization of the current crisis on the border, in quotes, and leaving aside the historical context that makes it clear that people from Central America is every much as right as other people living in the United States to be across the border. Don't you think we need to take a larger outside the box perspective on migration globally? I mean, it's so obvious that what we're doing right now doesn't work. It's a global problem. There's so many aspects to it. The only one that's in my memory was Jerry Brown in the United States during his first period as governor, when he suggested the idea of having a portion of the United States on either side of the border with Mexico dedicated to identifying workers and their families who are essential and letting them all have the rights of a person living in the United States. It occurs to me that kind of thought needs to go into the global problem of migration. Yes, focus on children. Yes, look at best rights, but we need to take an out-of-the-box perspective because migration is not going to go away, and we're still depending on the outdated Treaty of Westphalia concept of the nation state to determine who has a right to reside on one side or the other of a border. So forgive me for going on at length, but fascinating presentation, and you brought up all of the really good.
Thank you, Fred. Bill.
Yeah, thank you, Julie and Elaine. It was very provocative and very insightful. And as I thought about what you're talking about, I think for the most part, the technical question of the best interest of the child is totally lost, at least in the United States, because people, I think, don't realize that it's children that are involved. What we get in the media is the best interest of politicians. And somehow if we could actually address that media coverage so that people understood that these are children, children that are being harmed and hurt in ways that are in some ways unspeakable, that might help a little bit with the great cause that you're working on, even though the cause is great. And I appreciate the fact that you're working on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Mathilde.
Well, I already said my comment, but thank you so much for this great presentation. I really like the fact that you started by the best interest of the child. I know Marie, you know, we all work on that, and there's still so many question marks. And going back to a child is a child and is different from the child who is just next to him. So we have to go back on that. We're protecting all of them, but each of them. And yes, and I love your, you know, your focus also on durable and sustainable solutions. So not a band-aid, but something that's going to be sustainable. But good luck with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Niels.
Again, thank you so much. What I would be interested in how we could look at is the question of the 20 or 30,000 that are waiting. How can we reach with the best interest to all of them? And the challenge of scale is what I see as a huge challenge. And I don't know if who should have the responsibility outside government to try to convene the resources for it. Back to you, Everett. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Anna Lee, your final comment?
Hi, thank you for letting me join. It was really interesting. I'm not going to say much here, just that I'm looking forward to working more directly with the issue, and perhaps I'll get the chance to exchange with some of you a bit further and ask some of many thoughts and questions once I arrive in the US. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Krishna, final.
Thank you, Julie. That was really educational. It's not an area of my expertise, but I learned a lot. I also think, based on some of the recent experiences we have, is when it comes to complex issues affecting children with multiple violations of child rights, some of the community-based organizations that have the right motivation, who have gathered experience over years working with very dedicated effort, might be our biggest assets while we are talking at the system, policy, and resourcing. All the best.
Thank you very much. Julie, final comment from you?
Well, from the grassroots level all the way out to let's fix global migration, I think for those of us who continue to work on in this field, we still have a lot of work to do. Strategy is essential, and it's a question of leadership. Who leads the strategy? Is it a government-led issue? Is it a non-government-led issue? Is it a combination of? I think leadership is the key to strategy, and I think in the absence of somebody leading the group and all the turf wars that go on within the group, many of us have just gone to try to fix what we can fix based on what we do. But I agree, if there was a way to create a leadership that would bring people together, that would be amazing. It would be great if we could all agree on things, but I don't think that will happen. But I think it would be great if we could agree to do some things to really finally say, when the headline is, 5 years later, another surge, maybe the surge will be different. Maybe we'll have done something. Maybe we don't have to talk about what's actually happening when people are received. Maybe the issue is further down the food chain, if you will. So I would just love to see some change on this. And if we have to start small and build big, great. Scalability is always the goal, but you want to make sure that your small works. And that's sort of one of our things, is this whole process that we've set up. One of our goals is to seek funding to study it and make sure that this is really doing what we think it's doing, and making a difference in both building the durable solution and helping to address some of the root causes. So research is critical, starting small is important, and then building to scale if it works. And then looking for different global contexts. We have the advantage of being part of an international network. We're not the only ones dealing with this issue. Our colleagues in Switzerland, in West Africa, in the UK, they all are dealing with this issue. And we have this great opportunity to be able to exchange on how and what works. We all share the same principles of international conventions and the CRC. And it's a small and mighty group that starts the process, and hopefully the process is taken to scale. So we have a lot of work to do, is really the main conclusion.
Julie, thank you very much for being with us. It's been, as you can hear, a very stimulating discussion. And
thank you for having us.